welcome our committee, administrators, teacher representative, Mrs. McNally, Patty, our secretary, and let's begin with introductions and administrative remarks. Mr. Katini, do you have anything for us?
Sorry, I'm just getting situated here. I do. I have a couple administrative remarks. First, I'm pleased to announce that the public communication survey has been launched, and it went live last Friday. And we put something on the website about it, and it was in the Radnor Reader on Sunday. And to date, we've already had 130 responses. So I'm pretty taken aback, to be honest. Again, this is a survey open to just Radnor residents who do not currently have students enrolled in our district schools. So parents had their chance last April, so parents please do not complete the survey, but people that do not have children in our schools, we encourage them to go to our website where they can get a link to the survey, and we are also doing some promotion. We've put it out to different groups in the district, PTOs, the alumni, the legal voters. I've sent something out to Roberta to send around, and so we're excited. So that
Also in the paper.
Yeah, there was an article, I got an email from Radnor Patch about it.
Yeah, so you're right, it was in the Suburban and the Patch. So we will continue to spread the word. I'm going to send something out to Nikki in our TV studio to get something on the TV station, you know, some scrolls, and do some other outreach to different community groups that I haven't yet emailed, so including alumni. So good news there. The other admin remark would concern the communications administrative regulation, which, again, good news, has been posted, is now published to our website, so it is in effect, quote unquote. That went live last Friday as well, and there's a plan in place, or developing a plan to make sure that the appropriate people who are impacted by this AR are alerted and notified. There's nothing here that is changing in terms of how we do things. It's really just our operations put to paper. So we're happy that we've reached that point. We had this listener look at things, and we're really enthused that we can get that project completed. And then lastly, I wanted to draw attention to the board docs and a kind of an additional, I guess, feature that has been recently activated to try to help with people navigating it. And this will be when you go to the home page of board docs, so I can get there myself. Just start at the beginning. You'll see now there's been two what we'll call apps added to the home page here and here, so that people can easily access the agendas of the meetings and other documents without having to go into these tabs and to locate them. They're right there on the home page.
Great. Thank you very much. And we all got a copy of that new communications administrative regulations, all 14 pages of it or something like that. It was quite the undertaking, very comprehensive, and will lead to our being able to rescind 3 policies that are outdated and taking up our policy binders to be replaced by the multi-page AR. But it was a great effort, so thank you for doing that. All right, let's move on to public comment. Do we have any public comment today? Come on up, push the little green button. And sit. Get comfortable, you can take off your coat. Okay.
Yes, come up, yeah. You're on.
Okay. You can pull it closer if it's comfortable that way.
Hi, I'm Amy Shores of 54 Wentworth Lane.
I'm Lauren Williams of 211 Adley Road.
And we are here today representing a group of parents who want to thank you, the board, for addressing our letter we sent regarding our opposition to the legislation to arm teachers. We appreciate the board's responsiveness to this and bringing it forth to the committee meeting today, giving the great concern for it in the community currently. We look forward to seeing how this progresses, and thank you so much again for bringing it to the next step.
Thank you. Any other public comment today? afternoon, Mrs. Sherry.
Good afternoon. Just had a comment about this.
Okay, that's off.
Thank you. Just had a comment about the non-district family survey. Just a couple of quick questions. I guess Mr. Petit talked a little bit about where it's currently being advertised. I do have a have we advertised it at the library? That would be another suggestion. The senior center. And how about the Township website and its role? And also possibly the Republican and Democratic websites, just in terms of reaching people that might not have children in the schools. I didn't know, I wondered the questions, I looked at the questions. Did the board have any input on the questions, or who determined which questions should be asked and how long this survey should be open to the public? How do you decide to stop it at April 27th, for example? So they're my questions, and I look forward to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. More public comment? Good afternoon, Dr. Winters.
Good afternoon. I think Ms. Sherry's ideas of other ways to send the word around were great ones, and I would just like to also thank the parents who came up and noted how still the legislation inspired to arm teachers, and I would just like to make a comment as you advocate for legislation regarding gun violence, that you might also mention the fact that sleep deprivation is one of the causative factors of some of the symptoms that they're seeing. Children acting out, taking risk-taking behaviors, and engaged in kinds of antisocial and violent actions. So please mention sleep deprivation as you look to make our schools safer.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Annie Webb, Ivan Avenue, and I wanted to also express my support for the resolution against arming our school employees. And I mean, I'd really actually even like it to go further. I've read through it, I think it's great, but I would love for it to say that no matter what the state legislature decides, we will not approve arming teachers in our school. I did kind of note that you said school employees, and I guess maybe when you guys talk about it, you can clarify if I know we do have security guards, are they employed by the school, or, or is that an outside company? I mean, I guess I would, be open to having a discussion about whether our security guards, if they are ex-police or whatever, if they're trained, but I just would love this statement to say that we will never arm teachers and, support staff inside the building. I do have a question about the survey as well, just as you're talking about it. I read it too, and I'm curious, I guess there's no way for us to be sure that people are answering it who don't have kids. I mean, in the school. I could answer it, right? So is there some way as you're figuring out the data to, I guess, account for that, plus or minus in some way?
Okay. Interesting points. Thank you, Mrs. Webb. Is there any other public comment? Seeing none, let's move on to the...
I have a question now. I have a question, because after we hear public comment, are we going to then look and quickly answer the ones that we can? Weren't we?
Typically not.
Well, that was the direction that we were beginning to move in.
No. We don't want to put you on the
No,
spot.
I'm just saying,
No.
that's not the direction that we
No.
wanted to go.
I thought it was in the next meeting we would address it.
In the next
Yeah.
meeting,
Yeah,
we're
so
going to
the
do that.
next meeting,
Yes.
yeah. I
So,
think,
I'm confused, because I thought I heard somebody say that. That's it,
You did,
I did.
that someone was me. We did talk about the idea that if there are questions that are asked at the beginning of meetings, when appropriate, they may
When
be
appropriate,
answered
they can be
later
answered
during
back.
the meeting by the administrator or by the chair, or it will be at the following meeting. But we didn't say it would be like right at the response time, but we said that could happen later in the meeting, there could be answers to questions. But I think it depends on the question.
Gotcha. All right, I understand that now. Then during this meeting, if real quickly somebody can pop in with that during what we're doing, then they will answer those questions. Correct?
If they can.
If they can.
Yeah,
Okay,
something.
good.
Thank you for asking the question, Chuck. I got a chance to come up here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see
I'm
you there.
glad that you know that you might possibly get answers during the current meeting. That would be nice.
It's a briefing.
As long as the board has it. I was trying to listen to everything, Michael, but I missed the AR for communications. Is that posted, did you say, it's complete and posted? Okay. The other question, in going over the resolution for the voucher, I was not able to attend the meeting on Friday.
It's on
So-
video too.
It's on
You can watch it
further
online.
explanation of what the Senate Bill 2 covers, because
You can watch it online.
there are people who are not
Yes, right.
Yeah.
we're violating,
Move
or
this
answering my
along.
question in the middle of my question.
Sometimes they're just so tempting, you know? Okay, carry on, Mrs. Burrell.
Thank you. The voucher program, resolution, there are good voucher programs. I guess the question is why the resolution and why is the board so adamantly opposed to this program? Because in inner city, my understanding is vouchers to go, in New York City, they line up 1,000 people to get 20 places in a charter school to get vouchers, and that's very important to their education. So my question is a further explanation as to why the board is opposing this. And then also just in the resolution for the safety of the Radnor schools, my hope is that in the last half of you resolve the 3 points that may be overkill or to redo legislation that's currently involved. In other words, I'm sure that the federal government and the state of Pennsylvania already are addressing problems with school shootings and necessary funds to the schools. So that's something that maybe legislators to continue to enact this, add the word continue, because I'm sure there are bills out there that are already addressing those. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? No? Okay, so how about approval of minutes? Do we have a consensus to approve minutes? Did I say that properly? Approve minutes. Got my words juggled, so. All right, great. So let's move into agenda item number 1. The minutes are approved. And that would be the draft resolution opposing the Education Savings Account Voucher Program that has been proposed by the state. And as was mentioned earlier, we had the benefit of a public information session this past Friday morning at 8:15 a.m. that was led by Mary Curley, who is the Director of Communications and Legislative Services for the Chester County Intermediate Unit. The meeting was live streamed and is also was put out in this Sunday's Radnor Reader, a link to it. It's on the district website. It was, I think, almost every, Lydia wasn't here, but Sarah and Chuck were here. Extremely informative, really gives us a sense of why close to 200 out of the 500 school districts across Pennsylvania have currently written resolutions to oppose that legislation. It's a complex issue. It's hard to boil down. That's why we had it in an information session that took place over the course of about an hour. They were very informal with some Q&A. But for all intents and purposes, the reason why school districts are opposing this legislation is because it takes public school money away from those public schools that need it most. And the pathway to a non-public education for students is ostensibly flawed. When you dig down into that, as often happens with policy, ideas at this level can be wonderful, but the execution and accurate implementation of them is something different. And as you dig down into the details of the bill, you find that if in fact the premise for such a bill is to help all children find a pathway out of a less than optimal educational setting, the fact of the matter is the way this particular piece of legislation is designed, it would be those students, even in a lower income setting, who have the most relative means, who would be able to take advantage of that pathway out. thereby leaving behind their peers with still no pathway out, and those higher potential students in terms of the relative resources and ability to achieve would be taking the funding with them that the school would otherwise need to be able to continue to operate for those left behind. So at this point, that is why, and it doesn't happen that often, but close to 200 out of 500 school districts across all counties across the state, and we have a list of those who are opposed right here in Delaware County. In Montgomery County, almost every school district is opposed, and in Chester County, to this particular piece of legislation. So we felt that it was incumbent upon us to deliberate on taking a similar action as a committee, and that is what we're charged with doing today. So in your materials, committee members, you have seen a draft of that resolution. Most of these resolutions are drafted to be pretty much the same because the issues don't really vary, unlike some other resolutions might, depending on the topic. It doesn't really matter which school district you're in. We are all going to be impacted relatively the same. So the pushback points tend to be similar from district to district in their resolutions. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for discussion among the committee and see if in fact you feel comfortable with us as a committee moving this resolution as is forward to the full board for deliberation and a possible vote at our business meeting next week, or if there are changes you'd like to make, let's have some feedback.
So I'll jump right in. I fully support passing this resolution. And you did an excellent job of summarizing why I think we have pretty unanimous opposition to this. There's one other piece to this that you didn't mention, which is the special education piece. And the private schools are not held to the same standard that public schools are, but yet the money that's allocated for special ed will follow those students. So it's another way to sort of truly bankrupt the people that are really trying to provide for the neediest students. So I think there's many reasons that we should oppose this, and I think the way this particular resolution is written is very comprehensive, and I fully support it as it's written.
Thank you, Lydia. Sarah and Amy, would you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Lydia, I was going to say the same thing as you. I think the special ed component of this resolution is key. I also think talking about the accountability standards is so important. So to use public funds for a school that would not be held to the same standards or the same accountability that we would is so important to mention. I think that's nicely done. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Sarah, you have anything to add to that?
That was actually the point I was going to make. I think that the problem with that bill is that it's too often that it's going to benefit children of means who happen to live in a district or in an attendance area where the school has problems, and the money that they would take with them is not likely to fully cover tuition at a non-public school. So they're the one. So it's only the children of means who will actually really be able to use this money. And because those non-public schools do not have the same entrance requirements, we have to take everyone. They don't have to take everyone. So the children who already have problems will not be as likely to be able to use these vouchers and go somewhere else. They will still be stuck in that school, and the school will have lost that funding that it's helping to use to educate the least advantaged among the students. So I do have some significant concerns, especially because then we could send them with state money, tax dollars, to a school that doesn't have to meet the standards, even if the school they just left. So I think it's a real risk to the public education system, but I think it's potentially to the detriment of those students.
Great, thank you, Sarah, for that. Jeff?
Real quickly, I'm opposed to it, and the reason is very clear to me. It's giving public money to non-public institutions. Charters are actually, in Pennsylvania, charters are public schools. Charters are part of the public school system, so that money is going to another public school.
So,
No, they are. They are. The charters need to be approved by the public. They're all in Pennsylvania. They are all public schools, charter public schools. So I have issues with with charter publics, and it is a special education piece. This one I have an issue with because it's giving public money to non-publics, period. Everything about it is wrong. So that's my opinion.
Okay, any administrative remarks on the Resolution, okay. So, again, it's really hard to boil this bill down into a 5-minute conversation. That's why we had an information session on it. And please, we encourage everyone who has any questions about this prior to next week's vote to please take advantage of the resources on our website to learn more about this bill. So with that, I think there is a motion to move this forward to the full board for next week's business meeting for more discussion and a vote. I had a couple word changes that I would put in there real quickly that do not affect the meeting one bit, but I will talk to you offline about that, Mr. Petit. Very simple, just in replacing, putting non-public in more often, just to drive home the difference between public and non-public, public and non-public. That's it, just a style thing. So that said, let's move on to agenda item number 2. And on our agenda is a draft resolution regarding school safety for the Radnor Township School District. I'd like to open this up to feedback from my colleagues here on the committee.
A real quick question for our superintendent. Are our security employees of our township, of our school district?
Are they armed? Is that what you asked?
Are they armed? Do they work for us?
Security.
Yeah.
Our security work for the school district? That's the question, that's all. We're answering a question at the public forum.
Gotcha. So most of our security are actually hired by the district. We do have, I believe it is one position that is contracted, that we use an outside group who would contract that position. But the majority of those that work in security are employed by the district. Does that make sense?
It is good.
Did you have any other remarks you wanted to make on this, Chuck, before we turn it over to other members?
Real quickly, within this one, then, I guess I would be looking for us to put in this that our contracting.
Wait, what?
The conversation would be about whether we would want to increase this to include contracted employees not being on. That would be then the question of what we have for us. Is that covered in our resolution?
That's what I was thinking.
What Mrs. Webb said,
Right,
I think that's an excellent point, because even right now, if we don't, hopefully that doesn't happen, but sometimes we do end up contracting out certain services that are now, current school district employees. I think it should be, like Mrs. Webb said, made it really clear that anybody who's working on our premises, unless they are law enforcement officers, should not be armed. I agree with Chuck and Mrs. Webb on that.
Okay, let's get all the feedback and then maybe turn it to our, Sarah, do you have anything that you?
And just to be clear too, our security that we have are not armed.
No, I understand
Just want to make that, because I misheard your question, so I just wanted to make it clear that we didn't leave that lying up there. When we contract, we are essentially though, contracting and hiring that person is through an outside agency to come and work at our district.
Correct.
So we have a question so far hanging out there in terms of this bill that's been brought up by Chuck, but before we address that, why don't we hear if there are other questions? Sarah, do you have any feedback on this?
So I actually had the same question about school employees, because it appears anytime, and it may be that the actual legislation allows for the arming of school employees. That may be the specific language, but I would have the same concern about, anyone who is contracted to be in the school district. I mean, ideally we would just say there will be no weapons in the schools, right? If we don't want the student, and I understand law enforcement officials.
Yeah.
But only law enforcement officials would have the authority. I mean, presumably, we don't want parents bringing them or coaches bringing them. We don't want anyone. So I think that's one key point. Another point to be made, and maybe it's down the road, so we don't delay getting this to the board, but I would also like to say, to the extent that that legislation passes, not only do I not want it to be passed in Radnor, I don't want to send our kids to school districts where there are guns in the building. So that and that's something, it may be a conversation we have to have on another day, but interscholastic school events, right? We send our children to Model UN at somebody else's school, we send them to sporting events, we send them to debate club events. Do we as a community, if we say we won't have guns in our schools, is it okay to send our children to a school where there are guns? And I think that's a conversation probably for another day, but since we're looking at this, I wanted to raise it And then, I think it's a little sad that we're only mentioning Parkland when, given all the school shootings that have happened in the United States, but I get that there has to be one event that triggers this, but I would like to go on the record as saying it's a shame that it's taken till now to make a statement like this.
Can I interject quickly?
Sure.
Because I have an answer to a question that I think you kind of raised, and that's school employees and where did that name come from? I'm looking at the actual act, proposed act, and they call it school personnel.
Right, I pulled that up.
Okay.
So perhaps the solution is to replace, employees with personnel. And then secondly, you mentioned, not mentioning Sandy, the other places where peaceful tragedies occurred. We pulled, it's probably helpful to know where this came from. We pulled this mainly from TE.
Yeah.
And we also had the opportunity to look at a couple other districts in the area that did their own. And I looked through them, and I'm sure we all did, and there's some that go on this direction on the spectrum of being very more advocacy driven. Statistics are included in terms of how many people have been died from guns, etc. in the actual resolution. And then there's kind of the complete not opposite end, I should say, but more of the less just more to the facts, I guess, not facts, but just shorter, concise versions. And so it's up to us how we want to approach ours.
So firstly, I'm delighted that we're doing this, so I in no way want to slow this up. I want something to go to the full board this month. I do, actually, Sarah, I agree with the points that you brought up though. Since it's our resolution, do we also want to mention in the first sentence, and all the senseless tragic losses, or basically acknowledging, this isn't the first, and some of them were just as heartbreaking. So, something along the lines of acknowledging all of that. And then I also agree with, okay, this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the 7th paragraph, changing whereas school employees to school personnel. Because I actually agree with Ms. Webb that I would like this to be a little bit stronger. So that would incorporate contract people. So basically only people that could be in the building with weapons would be police officers, law enforcement.
Could I ask a question? So are we positive that the term school personnel would cover all subcontractors as well?
It would. Yeah, I think it would.
Okay, so
We can look into that, make sure it does.
that would be
We just
the-
want to go to the full board.
So whereas school personnel would be in paragraph 7, and then does anyone have language for the first paragraph that they
Well, may I just
like better?
say something before you move off of personnel?
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Batchelor, if the district were to at some point hire a school resource officer who would likely be armed, right? What category would someone like that fall under?
So in the districts that do employ a school resource officer, sometimes the district pays directly for that resource officer, sometimes it's a sharing of costs with a local government or a local entity. So it seems clear though what we're saying in this, in this resolution though, is that we're talking about, I think it's pretty clear that it's, trained law enforcement are in a different category. So a school resource officer would be trained law enforcement.
Okay.
And so that was actually one suggestion, kind of leaving open the door to the extent that the full board considers that. In the resolution, on the 3rd line where it says school employees, I would change that to anyone other than law enforcement officers.
And that makes it even clearer.
Which,
Where?
So in the resolution,
yeah.
Okay.
in the 3rd line where it says school employees, so it's above it says that would allow for the arming of school employees. I would say that would allow for the arming of anyone other than law enforcement officers. And we can use trained law enforcement officers since that's the term above if you prefer.
Yep. I
And
agree with
that actually, Amy, would address your concern about personnel versus subcontractors.
Okay, so we'll change it in 2 places, and then we still need wording for the first paragraph.
I would recommend that we keep the first one, and if you wanna add another beginning one, I would put
Okay.
a different one in that recognizes all the others, because
Okay.
we are taking this action because of the national dialogue that's been fostered by the students.
That's fair.
So
All
I
right,
do
that's
wanna,
very
I do
fair.
wanna keep
How
that in.
about inserting a second one that is whereas we are,
Well, we do have some samples, just
Send.
making note of the time, perhaps
Yeah.
we can pull them from something else and insert and circulate.
Yeah, I think we can give the direction, exactly. We'll give the direction to Mr. Keating to look and try, we wanna acknowledge other events, except for the Soul, besides just the events that happen in Florida, we wanna acknowledge the others, so we can do that before next week's meeting.
perfect, like, and sort of
You'll say.
encapsulate the tragic
Yep.
nature of it. Okay, perfect.
So, okay, so this is a resolution opposing legislation. There is no statement, as was raised in the public, about this being something regardless of legislation that may come into effect, what Radnor Township School District is resolved to do or not do. Is that something that we want to factor into this as well? That would essentially be another whereas, or just replace, it would be a shift in the meaning of this. I think that that's an important consideration. It was raised, and I want to just put that out there for future thought, given that it's 5 o'clock, but if there's any immediate brief feedback on that.
So my suggestion would be, because I agree, and I had the same thought when I read this, but given the short time frame, I think the initial urgency to this is because we know that the bill is being considered, and we want to let the legislature know that we in Radnor do not approve of the legislation. So my suggestion, but I'm open to amending it, is to send this through to the board this month, and then separately send through one specifically with respect to Radnor. If, however, we think it's gonna be easier to just talk about it all at once, I'm fine with that as well, and adding, I think you probably have enough at the top in terms of whereas clauses. I think you need to add more to the resolution, or a separate resolution that says, further, regardless of what legislation is enacted, Radnor Township School District, or the district, hereby states that we will not allow anyone other than a trained law enforcement officer to carry a weapon in our district.
Okay.
So what I would propose, I wanna make sure this goes through, and I wanna make sure it's timely. And so I propose that we put this through so that, to make sure it gets on the agenda next week, and then we have a second one that says what we here are gonna do, so that we don't hold this up.
Let's see, that, I know that that's a sense of
That could be
urgency.
included in it. Michael, wouldn't you be able to include that in by the time it gets to the full board?
For expediency's sake, maybe we have option A and option B, and that will speed the deliberation up, perhaps, rather than come back to it. What do you think of that?
Can I be clear? I'm gonna just, some points of order.
Mike?
Some points of order. So, when you say option A and option B, do you mean work up another resolution that includes something regarding how Radnor would, I guess, specifically stand?
I think it's just, I think it would just be adding a phrase about regardless of what legislation is passed. Radnor School District,
Is
resolved to not arm teachers with the exception of trained law enforcement. So really, that's the only that's the additional piece. And I think the question is do we want to add that now or do a separate resolution? And that would be the A and B suggestion, correct?
Right, and frankly, with one paragraph, I would say that why don't we go for that? We can always scale back, but at least that's in there, or change course if it's too much. Does that sound? I'm looking for the most expeditious yet thoughtful way to approach this, and I think if you go for the full menu and then cut back, it's easier than going with something skimpier and added. So, good,
Just one other
Sure.
clarification question. Do we want the resolutions to be as priority action items or consent items?
I think they can be on the consent agenda,
I go with priority.
but people can always pull them. What?
I think if you put
Let's
them on the
leave that
consent
to an
agenda.
administrative
Looks like we're
decision,
not
would that be okay?
Sure.
Thank you.
We'll talk
talk
at
about it Thursday.
we'll talk at leadership. The president sets the agenda, so.
Okay.
I would answer real quick. We can also address this. We can also address this rather quickly and kick it over to policy, correct? Could we not put a policy in place that our policy is that no armed personnel, blah, 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 blah. So I think not only can you put a resolution in, we could put it in our policy, which gives it more strength here in Radnor. So that's what I would do next, the policy, make sure you have that in policy.
Okay, I am trying to be very mindful of the time, but I do think, given the topic, it's important to have, with the public's cooperation, a brief final public comment. And if any public commenters would like to come up, please do so. The other thing I'd like to mention just quickly, because it came up, is that the legislature has not actually acted upon any specific school safety stuff, but there are probably 24 different submissions that have come since Parkland that the legislature is evaluating as we speak.
So just 2 quick points, and I apologize,
You're
as in
right.
English, is this on?
Yes.
Is that good?
No, it's
Okay.
off.
You're good.
As a former English major, when you do add the additional one, acknowledging other school shootings, to say something about, maybe you can say acknowledging other events since Columbine is probably the big beginning one that, and then in adding the additional comment about stating that Radnor, doesn't ever want our teachers to have guns regardless, your therefore specifically references the legislation. It says, therefore be it resolved, we oppose any legislation 1, 2, 3. So I think it has to be another therefore, or,
That's
addressing what we wouldn't do.
Right, thank you, Annie. Anybody else would like to make a public comment? No? Sure? Okay. Seeing none, is there any new business? Did I skip over that? Yes, I did. Any new business? Nope. Thank you very much, then we'll call it a day, and thank you all. See you next month.
Thank you to you, Amy and Michael, for putting those resolutions together so quickly. I know that was a last minute request. I appreciate it.
Can I also say one other thing? I want to thank the public for coming out, because you can see that the comments that these guys make really make a big, I just want to thank all you guys for coming out, because your input is so vital. Thank you, all of you. Great. Governmental process.